Bankwest's practices and its dealings and relationship with customers have been and continue to be appropriate. We maintain that the cause of the difficulties arose from a combination of economic factors, not through any inappropriate action of the bank. In cases where our clients were impacted, we work closely with them to try and improve their position.
Mr Luca, you said that your customers, the way they've been treated has been appropriate in your opening statement, correct?
Correct.
I've got a mountain of complaints came to my office, hence my pursuing of this Senate inquiry. Yesterday morning, I think it was, Mr Sean Butler, Taylor Woodings, I think, with the receivers sent in, no communication with him, sacked from his job, wife and 4 dependent children. He wouldn't agree with you, nor would our first witness this morning, Mr Jeffrey Raya, who worked with Mr Paul French as his business partner at a hotel in Cobar, nor would many, many other of your customers agree with that statement. Your treatment of your customers has been appropriate. Why did Bankwest send receivers into businesses such as that of Mr Paul French and Mr Jeffrey Rhea, who never had an overdraft, who had never missed a payment, who had worked hard? Why did the receiver just roll up on a door? Was it because of the LVR alone?
Firstly, there are a number of reasons why a bank would get to a position where appointment of a receiver. In most of these cases and the submissions you've received, we've worked with customers over a long period of time. I don't want to get into sort of the individual customers. I'm happy to sort of discuss those in camera, but just to touch on sort of the French one that you raised, the mine closure occurred in late 2008.
Yes, he's correct.
And the bank provided a number of concessions to the customer over the next 2.5 years, as converting principal interest payments to interest-only payments.
The loan started as a principal and interest, and then we moved it to an interest only for 12 months because obviously the business was in difficulty. And I suppose I'd just echo what Rob said, which is it's absolutely not in the interest of the bank to be calling in the receivers, which is why we do it in such a small percentage of cases. It's actually absolutely in our interests and, of course, in the interest of the customer to try and make sure we can get to a point where we trade our way out of any difficulties.
Well, Mr Ray this morning clearly stated that the financial sins he'd committed were a couple of days late on their payments. He said that kept their payments up. They reduced their principal from $1.3 million down to 1.25 or 26, I think. They almost had poker machine loans paid off, would have freed up another $50,000 a year. And his hotel was sold for around $750,000, box and dice. I find that concerning when, unless he is not telling the truth. He says he never missed a payment. Is he telling the truth? Except for those couple of days of late payments?
Well, again, our preference would be to discuss any matters in camera.
Do you think the valuation industry should be at arm's length, totally separate from the bank, and they do their job and you do your job?
I'd say that it's important that the banks work with valuers, important part to obviously the broader industry.
That's a political answer. That's spin. We've got the valuation industry here and the banking industry there. When you employ a valuer to do their job, should they be done at arm's length distance from you and then they just give you the report?
That's the way it operates.
That is the way it operates? Then why have I seen an email where one of your bank managers is suggesting to the valuer to devalue the assets by 20%? Isn't that interference?
We'd be happy to have a discussion about that email. We've got a copy here, assuming it's the same email that we've got a copy of.
Well, I hope there aren't many more.
Well, we'd just firstly like to see the email that you have.
I think, Senator, in that instance, you've probably seen half of an email. The reality of that situation, which is absolutely common practice across all of the banks, is that in all cases we try and sensitise valuations to understand what would happen if the value of certain assets fell, what the impact on the customer would be. And I think when you read the rest of that email, what you'll see is that the bank colleague is trying to understand what would happen in those sensitised environments. It's just helping us to understand what the impact would be on the customer. It is not us directing the valuer to reduce a valuation by 20%, which we would never do.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Caulfield, but it does say, I have spoken to the valuer again Friday to gauge his opinion, and I suggested a reduction of, say, 20% on the existing valuation. And he was of the opinion that this was a bit bullish, and maybe 10 to 15% is the nearer mark. It is still a suggestion from your bank manager about a valuation.
As the bank officer was doing analysis on further funding for the client. Yep. So it was all about sensitising.
A previous witness here today, just before you, Mr. DeLuca, was a bloke by the name of Guy Goldrick. It was July 2008. When strangely the tap of finance was turned off. I want to take you back to your bank in July 2008. Obviously HBOS was in serious trouble. You agree?
It was in trouble, yes.
Well, it went broke. I'd call that serious trouble. Would you agree they were in serious trouble?
Yes.
Mr. DeLuca, I refer to your opening statement about the insolvency practitioners, liquidators, administrators, receivers. They come under the Corporations Act. Yes. Section 420A is about selling assets off, doing their best to attain market value or close to market value. We had a witness earlier on today whose property was valued, or he might have had a sale for $4 million. It was sold for $635,000. After the sale was revalued at $3.8 million. That appears to me not to be meeting market value.
Well, I'm not sure which client you're talking to or submission you're referring to, but in general terms, again, during the global financial crisis, valuations fell south quite significantly across a number of areas, and therefore solvency firm was only able to achieve that price for the asset that was the market.
Well, why would it be valued at $3.8 million after the sale, shortly after, not 50 years after?
Again, I'm not sure which submission you're
this
referring to.
I mean, I was talking to a lady last night. You chased her for the loan, you lent her a lot of money. But they're living in limbo, not knowing whether tomorrow you're going to send a receipt. They've got $100,000 in the bank put aside. They meet their payments all the time. But the stress it puts on this lady, her husband, her children, is humongous. And that's where I often say, you deal with the figures, we deal with the people. What I'm looking for is a commitment. If people can make their way, will you please be gentle with them and give them some breathing space and help them through it, instead of some of the cases we've heard of?
And as I said, Senator, it's in our interest to work with our customers, not in our interest actually to default on customers and lose money.
What was Operation Magellan?
It was a review of our portfolio. We do regular reviews of our portfolio. I'd just taken over running the business bank at that point, and we had a look at across our portfolio, which we do on a fairly regular basis, and that's what that particular project was.
When you had a look at it, what did you see?
Well, at that point, it was the start of 2010. Obviously, the financial crisis had hit, and what we saw was that a number of customers were obviously either in difficulty in terms of their payments or the value of the businesses that they had fallen significantly.
And hence, their LVRs went up?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And hence, you took the appropriate action when the LVRs were at a level out of your control?
At that point, obviously, we tried to work.
You weren't happy with.
We tried to work with the customers to see whether there was a way of getting through the position, or whether or not actually the business was at a point where it needed to be, where further action needed to be taken.
Why has Bankwest registered the websites unhappybanking.com and unhappybanking.com.au?
I can't comment on this, sir.
Ms. Tyndall, you don't know?
Senator, I'll take that under notice and revert back to you.
You missed one. unhappybanking.net.au. So, I mean, you've got to take those risks out, it's obviously to cover up for what the unhappy banking campaign is doing.
Our branding out there is happy banking, and therefore we'd like to own everything we can around happy banking.
If someone's got $1 million asset and owe you $1 million and they're heading down the tube, if you raise your interest rate to default rates, let's say it's 18%, you obviously compound that on, they're in trouble, they can't pay you. That amount of your loss is then tax deductible afterwards, is that correct?
We work with each customer individually to understand, what the business can actually bear. As we've said a couple of times, it's absolutely not in our interest to be putting rates up and pushing the business out of business as a result. So we work with customers on an individual basis to understand what can be done.
You didn't answer the question. When the interest rate goes up, compounds, if they're worth $1 million, you sell our asset for $1 million, owe you $1 million, you compound 18-20% interest rate on for 12 months. That shortfall, is it tax deductible? It's a yes or a no.
To the customer?
To the bank. Is it tax deductible to the bank? If you've got a loss on a customer where they owe you $1 million, it compounds out to $1.2 million with these high rates, you sell an asset for $1 million, you're $200,000 short. Is that $200,000 tax deductible?
The interest income is income. It's not tax deduction, it's income.
But isn't that $200,000 a loss on your books? If you've got a customer who on your book owes you $1.2 million, and you've sold him up, cleaned her out or whatever for $1 million, and there's a loss of $200,000, is that loss tax deductible?
The loss is.
Yes.
The loss is not the interest income.
By having huge default interest rates, that surely builds that amount to a situation where in some cases, or many cases, these bad loans, that leads you to a greater tax deduction. Would that be the case?
Well, firstly, it's in our interest actually to make profits, so not to actually have losses. And as Ian alluded to, also our interest there is aligned with the customers. The customers actually rehabilitated and actually able to pay and service their debt. As Ian alluded to, we negotiate and work with the customers on a case-by-case basis on what the right default rate is.
You haven't answered the question. If that money goes out because the debt explodes by a very high interest rate level, the more that goes out and the more you have on your books has not been repaid, is that tax deductible? So, yes, it is.
So technically, yes, if it causes a further loss, then it would be tax deductible. But as we've said, those interest rates simply reflect the additional costs that are in the business. So the reality of what's happening through the P&L of the business is that actually we're no better off. In fact, we're worse off from customers that.
I'm seeing a situation here. The Australian Taxation Office might look at this and say, okay, this loan's gone bad. But then when you can put up interest rates, default rates 18-20% when official cash rates are 3.5%, and you can put on your book, that is a big tax deduction because in that last 12 months of the dying period of the loan, it allows you to actually escalate your losses very quickly. You know you're going to lose dough. You know they've fallen over. Doesn't that allow you for a greater tax deduction come the end of the year of doing your books?
As Ian alluded to, technically, yes.
Yeah, but you can determine the interest rate, which then determines the level of loss. That's a pretty good business deal, isn't it?
Well, except
in any instances, have you appointed receivers with your customers purely on the basis that a change to the loan to, or the change in the loan to valuation ratio? Is that a practice where you would, if you do your valuation,
it wouldn't typically be solely for the LVR. It wouldn't typically be just solely.
Okay, but you can't rule out that might have happened in some cases solely.
It might well have done because that would be a covenant within the contract. And what happened during the financial crisis, Senator, is that some of these businesses, their market value fell by between 50 and 80%. And in those cases, especially when the market is continuing to fall, it's very often in the best interest of the customer and the bank to act early rather than late.
That's a judgment call that you make.
It is a judgment call.
And usually, and presumably you can make that without consultation with the customer to see whether they think it's in their best interest as well.
No, in all instances we would have discussed those with the customer. Now, clearly, we might not be agreeing with each other, but yes, it is ultimately a judgment call. But always there's been a discussion attempted with the customer.
If in some cases your customers are put into receivership on the basis of a valuation that you've done, in those circumstances, could you provide a copy of the valuation to? And this is really where it's used as the trigger to actually kick off impairment. Otherwise, meeting loan repayments, all other things, everything square. Wouldn't it be interesting of the customer to also see, so that they know what is about to hit them and why?
So, firstly, if it's only the LVR that's moved and the customer's making repayments, their account conduct's been fine, there are no issues with any other creditors, we'd obviously be trying to work with the customer through the process.
Okay, well, you've seen the submissions, but some of those witnesses suggest that the receivers have turned up without any warning, without any discussion, without any ongoing relationship discussions, or how we might actually help you work through this, as you've discussed that you would do. Now, that evidence is clearly inconsistent with yours, and where's a committee going to have to try and work through that and work out where the truth is, or where the reality of that is. Now, we've also heard evidence through the course of this inquiry that some of the customers are aware of, or alternatively have actually found potential buyers for all or part of their businesses, and have approached the receivers that you've appointed and have either been ignored or had those offers rejected, and then subsequently the property on which the security was held was sold for a much lower level. Are you aware of stories along those lines?
Yes, and obviously over the course of the financial crisis, again, valuations fell very dramatically.
That's right. But if your customer in trying to work with you to sort out their problems, as you say, comes to you and says, look, I've got somebody who's willing to buy this part of the security for this amount of money, and that would have substantially paid off a lot of the money that's owing to you, that's rejected, and then later on the whole lot of the security is sold for a price that's even lower. It doesn't really fit into what you're saying about the GFC lowering prices, because in the midst of it they had somebody who was willing to pay more.
And that sounds unusual.
We had evidence this morning that in one case where there had been interaction between Bankwest and the customer, but the interaction was more about proceeding with the loan and when it was going to restart, and dealing with new builders that were being brought in, etc., etc. And then, without any warning that it was likely to happen, they were given 24 hours notice to repay the loan in full. Is that something that could happen?
So typically, the conversation, communication with the customer would be an ongoing process, and if there are issues with the facilities and the arrangements and customer was in default, then communication regarding that would happen over a period of time.
Yeah, well, the allegation here is, and I actually asked them, I said, well, what communication had occurred, and the communication that we were told that occurred was merely about how they were going to try and get everything back on track. And a lot of things that they were dealing with, there were delays, there were, I think the original facility had expired and they were looking at renegotiating a new facility, and then without any warning or any sort of saying, okay, well, we've had enough, we're not going to proceed anymore, they basically got a notice saying 24 hours, you've got to pay in full. That doesnnn't sound...
And as Ian alluded to, I'm sure there's two sides of the story. We'd be happy to have a look into that.
Which is why I'm putting it to you. I mean, this has been put to us. I want to test it all.
Absolutely, but I guess what I'd say is we work extensively with our customers to try and remediate problems, and we've got a large and dedicated team that work with those customers. We would not be calling a loan in 24 hours unless that was at the end of a very protracted period.
So a protracted period of discussing
Absolutely.
The problems with the
problems,
loan,
the issues,
the potential
what we're going to do about it. Yeah.
Would you discuss the potential for such a notice to be delivered if things weren't resolved?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
East Coast development and hoteliers seem to be where the problems arose.
And a number of those are industries that were probably the hardest hit as well.
Yeah, but were they hit that hard where you had to withdraw funds from completing projects? That's one. I mean, I can't understand this, why a project wasn't completed. You're in partnership with those borrowers. It's a partnership arrangement.
As I said earlier, it's not in our interest to default customers and lose money. It's in our interest to work with them. So,
do you know how much the East Coast market has collapsed since the global financial crisis in a percentage term of real estate?
It's very wide-ranging depending on which state you're in, which sector of the state. But you know, what I would say is, again, on some of those developments, they were not going to be worth anywhere near the value that the customers felt they were going to be worth when they set out on them.
Well, I just think if they dropped 30% in value, there was probably 30% fat in the project. It could have come out square.
The reality is that some of those markets dropped between 50 and 80%, and they have not recovered.
I come from a regional area, been there all my life in the regions now. You were concerned about the LVRs when those assets were reduced in value, right? Okay? That was your concern?
Yep.
Hence you took various actions. Mr. Caulfield, if we go into global financial crisis number 2, and let's say the price of real estate reduces 20% around Australia, especially in places like Sydney, etc. If you're going to go on the LVRs, you're going to have a hell of a lot of places to sell up in a couple of years' time if that global financial crisis Mark II hits. Will you then look at your LVRs or whether those families can afford to pay their home loans? This is going to be a problem if we have another reduction in the value of assets.
And it is absolutely not in our interests to be calling in loans. Yeah. We always seek to try and work through with the customer to get to an end result that works for them and for us.